is the third week in our grace series. We've talked about how grace is greater than your sin, how grace is greater than your hurts, and of course today we're going to be focusing on how grace is greater than our weaknesses. Now, if you have your Bibles, if you would turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, just hold that. We're going to be kind of flipping around from chapter 11 to chapter 12. And here's what we're going to see. Paul is going to challenge this church in Corinth not to celebrate in strength and not to celebrate in accomplishments, but to celebrate in weaknesses. Because when we are weak, that weakness gives space for God's grace to show up. That weakness is the place where God's power could be most visibly demonstrated. And so he's going to write to this church in Corinth. Now, what you need to understand about Corinth is that it was a destination city, like Los Angeles or Atlanta or Chicago. It's where you went to experience culture. And they were known for their luxurious lifestyles, for their impressive architecture, for their elite socialites that lived there. It was a place of pleasure and exotic living. Sometimes you still hear the reference, the Corinthian style, which is this architectural style marked by large columns meant to demonstrate power and strength. That's what this city was like. It had a lot of value placed upon things like strength, education, and accomplishments. And so Paul writes in 1 Corinthians to them, and now he's writing 2 Corinthians. And between the time those letters arrived to this church in Corinth, some false teachers had come on the scene. And they were winning people over in the church by using their strength. In other words, they were showing their religious resume, saying, look what I've done, look what I've accomplished, and therefore, since you see how strong that I am, you should follow me. This kind of sounds like the way we kind of do things today. But they say, look what we've done. And Paul is in an interesting predicament here because he has an impressive resume. Paul does. And he could use that resume if he wanted to come up against these guys who are coming out there saying, hey, look at my resume. Come follow me. But Paul doesn't do that. Paul does he goes about it a little bit differently. And this is what he says. But the thing is, Paul doesn't want the church to be won over by human strength and accomplishments, by human wisdom. He wants the church to delight in weakness so they can experience fully God's power. And so he's going to challenge them not to hide from or run away from or disguise their weaknesses, but instead he's going to challenge them to celebrate their weaknesses. And that's what we want to be challenged with today. It's a challenge for us too, because like Corinth, we live in a culture and a time in a society where we put a ton of emphasis on strength. I don't know about you guys, but raised in a children's home, you never showed you were weak. You might not have been stronger than anybody else, but you didn't show it because they would take that and just run with it. And you probably, maybe some of you in that same situation, you don't want people to see that you're weak, because if you're weak, people take advantage of you, right? And people want to do things that maybe they wouldn't do to anybody else because they know that you are going to have to take it because you're not very strong. And that's kind of how it is with some people. But Paul is going to flip it for us. He's going to say, look, what you should delight in is not your strength, but your weakness. Because in your weakness, there's room for God's grace and for God's power. So here's how he's going to do this. He's going to write this church, and he's going to start off by giving them his strength. He's going to say, look, here's where I'm qualified, and here's how I'm valuable and strong from your perspective and your value system. So he could easily just take it from his, because if he was to be himself, he wouldn't do this. This is not like Paul, and we'll show you how that is not Paul in just a minute. But he's trying to say, okay, here's how I'm going to be able to reach these people with this message. I'm going to have to take it from their perspective. So look, here's where I'm qualified. Here's how I'm valuable and strong from your perspective. Because Paul knows if he is seen as weak and then tells them to celebrate their weaknesses, then that's not going to mean very much. Because, of course, a weak person is going to say, celebrate weakness, right? Of course not. So he wants to see that the standards are strong, and he's going to kind of take all of this value and all of his strengths, and they see he's going to kind of just wad them up, and he's going to kind of throw them away. Because it's not going to make a difference in what he's about to tell them. So here's how he begins in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, start with verse 21. He says, whatever anyone else dares to boast about, okay, I just want to stop for a second. You've got these false teachers coming and saying, look how impressive we are. And he says, I'm speaking as a fool. I can't believe I'm going to say what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it. I also can boast about. Whatever they can say about themselves, I can say about myself. And then he goes on with a list. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? Me too. Are they Abraham's descendants? I am as well. Are they servants of Christ? And then he adds this. He says, I am out of my mind to talk like this. It is so unlike him because his whole approach to ministry, if you know Paul, is to make a difference in the world, is not to elevate himself, but to do what? To elevate Christ. And so Paul was out of himself when he's talking like this. He says, I'm talking out of my mind. But he's making a case that for their value system, that his background, his heritage, his passion, and his zeal would be very impressive. He continues with this in chapter 12, starting in verse 1. He says, this boasting I am doing will do no good, but I will go on. He says, I will reluctantly tell about my visions and revelations from the Lord. I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. Only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside my body. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise, caught up to this third heaven. And he says, I heard things so astounding they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. That experience is worth boasting about, but I'm not going to do it. Look, I was caught 14 years ago. I was caught up in this third heaven. Not the first heaven, not the second heaven, but the third heaven. And I don't even know what he's talking about, to be honest with you. But he was caught up into this third heaven, and he says, I saw some incredible things, but I'm not going to brag about him, he says. 14 years, this is the first time he's mentioned it, and it's just in passing. And he only tells us enough to tell us he's not going to tell us anymore. 14 years. Let me tell you something, be a little transparent. I'm going to be honest with you. If I was caught up in this little third heaven thing, it would be a part of everyday conversation with me. Oh, your children are walking now. Well, I was up in third heaven. You know, I mean, everything, I'd have a book. You know, my book would say, the third heaven, thoughts on why God chose me and not you. You know, just try to work it in every type of conversation you possibly can. You know, be in my bio, everywhere I go. Here's to me in the third heaven. It'd be a big deal. But Paul mentions it after 14 years, and then he goes on to say anything else about it. Instead, how does he tend to introduce himself? How does Paul do this? When he introduces himself, he calls himself what? A slave. He's a slave. Now, a slave is known not for the resume. That's why they're a slave. And it's not their heritage or their lineage. Again, that's why they're slaves. And Paul refers to himself as a slave of Christ. A slave is really only known for one thing, and that's their master, the master that they serve. And Paul says, really all you need to know about me is that I am a servant of Jesus. I'm a slave of Christ, and nothing else really matters. But he acknowledges that he has got a pretty impressive resume. He was educated under Gamaliel. Now, this, you don't hear a lot about who this person is, so I had to do a little bit of research because I really didn't know who it was, to be honest with you either. And it turns out in the Christian tradition that he actually was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was a Pharisee, also a rabbi, but he was the head. And there's a little bit of irony here too, if you will, because Paul taught underneath him, and it turns out that Gamaliel was actually pro-apostle, if you will. He actually would be the one that would argue for the apostles in the Sanhedrin, it turns out. And here we have Paul learning under him, and he was a persecutor of Christians. And later on, of course, he saw the light and started following Jesus. But he studied under Gamaliel, which was an impressive school. He has all the right credentials, and it would have been easy for him to be proud, to put his confidence, if you will, in his own strengths. And so he talks about the fact that God gave him a thorn in the flesh, a weakness, so that he would be what? Dependent upon God. So check this out. Verse 7, chapter 12. He says, so to keep me from becoming proud, to keep me from putting the confidence in myself, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times, he says, I begged the Lord to take it away. Now, there's a lot of speculation, of course, to what or perhaps who this thorn might be, right? There's a lot of different thoughts that people have on this. And I know the funny one that everybody likes to say is that he was married. I'm surprised y'all laughed about that. Thank you. I was like, my wife's not here, so I can say that one. But no, if I didn't have my wife, I'd be nothing. But we do know it's significant because 3 times that is. I'm sure he asked God more than 3 times. But he says here, I asked God 3 times to take it away from me. And he's on his knees weeping and begging, God, take it away. Just take it away. Now, I don't know what it is for you. If we were to turn this back on yourself, I don't know how you identify what your thorn is. What is it about you in your relationship that is keeping you from having that great relationship with God that you could possibly have? There's got to be something. Everybody has something. It doesn't be major. You know, we all have flaws. We all have things we're dealing with. We all have things that Satan's trying to overcome us with. And so that's the one thing that maybe we need to get rid of to show God that we're willing to serve him and be his slave. A slave of righteousness, if you will. Paul here, he calls it a messenger from Satan. So he recognized that this is from Satan. But he also acknowledges, though, that God could take it away if he wanted to. So it's from Satan, but God allowed it. That's a helpful view for us when we experience the thorns of this life, that Satan does send it, but God can take it away. So why doesn't he? Well, God answers Paul. Verse 9. Paul says, every time I begged for him to take this thorn away, here's how God replied. He said, my grace is all you need. My grace, my power works best in your weakness. Okay, so if the power works best in weakness, Paul concludes, here's what he says. Now, I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses. I don't ask God to remove the thorn anymore. I step into the weakness. I take the pleasure in the weakness. I take pleasure, he says, in the insults, the hardships, the persecutions, the troubles that I have to suffer for Christ. Why? Because I am weak, but he is strong. I used to plead for God to take away the weakness, to take away the thorn. I don't ask him to take it away anymore because I understand now that weakness, that thorn that I would have done anything to get rid of, I would have done anything not to have to go through. That's where I experience God's grace now more powerfully. That's where God's power works best, and that's where God's power is going to work best, is in our weakness. Now, we don't celebrate our weaknesses that well, do we? Instead, we tend to run from them, or we tend to try to hide them. We deny them. Paul says, nope, take pleasure in them. You take pleasure in that thorn. You take pleasure in that weakness because that's where you're going to meet God's power. So here's what I want to do. I want to try to give you a few equations that I think will help us understand that grace is greater than. And here's the first one. Grace is greater than our infirmities. The word thorn here, it's not the idea of this little thorn of a rose bush. It's translated, if you will, it could be a stake or even a spear. It could be translated that way. But the idea is that it isn't just like an annoying itch that you just can't quite reach. It's significant. It's keeping him from being who he wants to be. It's keeping him from doing what he feels like God has called him to do. So he's making a case. He's saying, I'm begging you, God, take it away. But God says, no, it's better if you're weak. Because if you're weak, I have space. I have space to demonstrate my strength. Now, some people think that the thorn is like a sin struggle that maybe Paul had, like a temptation that he was dealing with. But the word flesh here, it tends to indicate that it was more physical in nature, that it was a physical infirmity. There are a number of different ideas as to what it might be. Some people think that Paul's thorn in the flesh is that he was deformed. He had some kind of deformity. He was just unattractive because, hey, look, you don't get beaten and thrown stones at that many times without having a little bit of scar. So his reference is in some of his writings. In fact, just in chapter 10 of 2 Corinthians, it says that his appearance was an obstacle for them receiving the message. So people were distracted by the way he looked. Another idea that some people have is that maybe Paul was epileptic, that he had the problem with epilepsy. One of the pagan ideas during that time was that people with epilepsy had a demonic spirit, and the people in the community would spit on that person. And so here's the message in Galatians where Paul thanks the church in Galatia for not spitting on him, just out of the blue. It's a random thank you note. I mean, there must be some reason why he's thanking them for not spitting on him. And so people think, well, maybe he struggled with epilepsy. You know, a large number of people think that it was eye trouble. There are a few different reasons why they determined that the thorn was eye trouble here, because the most noteworthy would be in Galatians. We know Paul dictated his letters. And in Galatians 6, he talks about how he's now writing. And he says, you'll notice I'm writing in my own hand because of the large letters. So some people think that he had eye problems, which, of course, in that time, what he did would have been a significant challenge. We don't know for sure. There are other cases that were made, migraine, speech impediment. Paul talks about how he mumbles. He was not a good speaker. Some people say maybe even stomach problems. You could guess. It really doesn't matter because we all have something that we deal with that's considered a weakness. But Paul tends not to mention things, and he didn't mention this as well. He doesn't get specific. And I think he doesn't do it for two reasons. The same reason, number one, the same reason he didn't tell us that he was caught up into this third heaven until 14 years later. It's the same reason he goes into all the detail about the thorn in his side. He doesn't want this to be about him. He's trying to keep what he's about to say from coming back to him. He wants the focus, the total focus, to be on who? On Jesus Christ. The second equation is this. Grace is greater than my inabilities. Usually when we hear the word weakness, we associate it with talents or abilities. We don't have what it takes to get the job done. You go on a job interview and they'll ask, what's your greatest weakness? That's actually a very hard question to answer because you don't want to tell the truth. Because they won't hire you. So you try to come up with something that sounds like a weakness, but it's really a strength. So, you take a class on a job interview and they'll tell you, say things like this. I'm a very task-oriented person. It's my weakness. It's kind of a struggle that I have. You see, it's something that needs to get done and I just do it. It's a weakness. I'm working through it, but if you'll hire me, I'll try to keep that at bay. Or they'll say something like, well, I tend to be a little bit of a workaholic. Like my life, I get so focused on jobs that my life gets a little out of balance. It's just a weakness that I have. They try to disguise their strengths as weaknesses. And that's what we kind of do. We disguise our weaknesses. We announce our strengths, and we put this confidence in ourselves. And we don't let people see where we're struggling. There was a book that came out, a business book. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called Strengths Finder. But part of the book was that you would go online and take a Strengths Finder assessment. And what it would do is you'd have to answer all these questions, and then it would bring up your top 5 strengths. Those are really cool things to do. It's helpful because it makes you feel good. And then it also allows you to see how you can hopefully work well with others. But I think if Paul was to recommend a book, that his book might sound something like this, Weakness Finder. It's where you actually have to identify your weakness. You look at areas of your life where you're weak, where you don't have what it takes, where you lack the ability. And you say, that's a weakness. That means God has the opportunity there to really demonstrate his power. Instead of celebrating my strengths, I'm going to celebrate my weaknesses because that's where I can allow God to enter in and become powerful. I'm not going to hide it. I'm not going to disguise it. I'm going to embrace it because that's where I'm going to know God's grace. In Acts chapter 4, verse 13, it's about the disciples and the impact they were making. And it just says, when they, referencing the religious leaders, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished. And then it goes on to say, and they took note that they had been with Jesus when they realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men. So here's what's interesting about this. What astonished the religious leaders was that they were ordinary. What did they expect? They expected these giant men of the community, probably people like them, probably wondering why it wasn't one of them, to be these astonishing speakers and men of the community, people that were well respected. But when they saw the authority that Peter and John were talking in, it was hard not to be amazed and to be impressed. And they were just ordinary men. And what I love about this is that God always takes ordinary people and makes them extraordinary. And that's everybody. Doesn't matter who you are. So grace is greater than your infirmities. It's greater than your inabilities. And there's a book that captures this idea. It was from the book Tramp for the Lord by Corrie ten Boom. And I'll just read you the story. She tells about this woman that she met in Russia during the Cold War where there's a lot of Christians who were being heavily persecuted. And she writes this. This old woman was lying on a small sofa propped up by pillows. Her body was bent and twisted and almost beyond recognition by the dread disease of multiple sclerosis. Her aged husband spent all his time caring for her since she was unable to move off the sofa. In fact, there was only one part of her body that she could control. It was the index finger of her right hand. And so with that one finger, she would type all day, every day, often late into the night. But this woman wasn't just typing, she was translating. And with that one finger, she would translate the Bible and Christian books into Russian. Her husband hovered close by and explained to me that sometimes it takes a long time for her to hit the keys. It took a very long time for each key. And Corey ten Boom says that as she looked at this woman, wasted form on the sofa with her head pulled down and her feet curled under her body, she just cried out inwardly, Lord, why don't you do something? Why don't you heal her? She says her husband sensed her anguish and gave her an answer. He said, God has a purpose in her sickness. Every other Christian in the city is being watched by the secret police. But because she has been so sick for so long, no one ever looks on her. They leave her alone, and she is the only person in all the city who can translate undetected by the police. God uses our weaknesses to make a difference. Now, if you saw that woman, you would not be impressed with her. Definitely not her strengths. You might feel sorry for her. You might even pity her. But isn't it interesting that one thing that seems to be destroying her, it isn't? Isn't it interesting that the one thing she would most likely want to change, the one thorn that she would most likely have to not have to go through, the one thing that God uses, and he uses it powerfully. His grace comes in to that space. And maybe it's a physical illness, or maybe it's just a lack of having what it takes, but it creates the space. And if you want to experience God's grace, you need to have the opportunity for God to have some space to go into. But here's the challenge that I have, right? Like, one of my weaknesses is not really knowing my weaknesses. Maybe you're like me. They like to hide from us, like some of the people around you, they know your weaknesses. But we have a hard time knowing on our own because we don't want to accept it, or again, we're back in that denial method. We have a hard time admitting to ourselves. And so in my pride and insecurity, I don't want to be weak. My wife might put it this way: I don't like being vulnerable. Not just with her, not just with you, but just in general. I don't like being vulnerable. But here's the problem. God's grace meets us at the point of our vulnerability. You want to know and you want to experience God's grace, don't you? You have to be weak. You have to be vulnerable. And here's what I'm learning. Your third point. Grace is greater than my insecurities. And that's a struggle. We don't like to say things like, I need help. I don't like to say things like, I'm having a rough time. I don't like to say things like, I'm stuck and can use a hand. I don't like to say things like, I'm in over my head. We don't like to say things like, I don't have what it takes, or I'm not sure what to do. And if you're a guy, you don't like to say, I'm lost. Those words are not a part of my regular vocabulary, and they maybe not be a part of yours, but those words are where I learn about grace. Those moments that require me to say those things carry with me the most potential to experience God's power in my life. So doesn't it make sense then that we would delight in those things? To actually delight in our weaknesses? That those moments where we just don't know what to do, those moments where we don't have what it takes, those moments where we feel overwhelmed, where we feel insecure, where we feel vulnerable, if that's where God's grace and power is most clearly demonstrated, doesn't it make sense that we step into it instead of stepping away from it? It does. There was a guy in high school. He wasn't real strong, but he tried to work out all the time. And this is not me, so don't look. You know how people tell stories, this guy, that's not me. And he's in the gym, and he's working out, and he sees this guy in there. He's got muscles on top of muscles. He's like a very intimidating guy. You go in there and go, you don't want to lift anything, because if you do, you're like, just look at that guy. He's lifting everything. And so he was very intimidated, and the guy was very strong, and he was lifting like something crazy, like 300 pounds or something, or more. And he's sitting there, he's thinking, I want to try that. I want to try and lift that. But he's not stupid. He's not going to do it in front of anybody. So he's going to wait till the place clears out, and he's going to try to lift that weight. And so everybody leaves eventually, and he's up, he gets under the bench, he puts the proper weight on. And it's funny because, one of the first things that you learn about lifting is that you never try to lift your max weight or any kind of weight really without a spotter, somebody that's going to help you. And because if it happens, the weight gets stuck. And, so here's what you think might happen. You kind of know where the story's going, right? You might think that he tried to bench it and he lowered it and that he couldn't get it back up all the way. And then you might think that at that point, maybe he called that big, strong guy and he come running and he helped him and he pulled the weight up for him. And then he would say something like, when we have so much weight on us, we ask for God's help and God's grace comes a-running. We could throw out an illustration like that, but you might think it went like that. That's not how it went, though. That's not how the story goes. Here's what happened. He was laying on the bench. He had the weights on either side. He put his hands up on the bar and he gripped it. And he could feel those adrenaline. And he just looked at the stack of weights on either side and he decided not to do it. That's how the story goes. Not as dramatic. He got up and he put the weights back and he never told anyone about it until much later. And he just got up and walked out. Do you know why, though? He would rather not try than to be put in a position where he had to ask for help. He would rather not try than run the risk of being vulnerable. He'd rather not try than have somebody watch him, and he doesn't do it. Now, that's okay maybe in the weight room. But that's not okay in this auditorium or in this world. It's not okay at home. It's not okay to say, well, look, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, so I'm not even going to try it. I'm just going to, avoid these moments. And I can't help but wonder how many times I've done that. I've missed out on God's grace and power in my life. Not because I was strong, but because I was too proud to be weak. And in that weakness, it's in that moment where God's grace is demonstrated the most powerful. So Paul starts off in 2 Corinthians and he kind of talks about how this was true for him personally. That he's going through these difficult times, and he says, in his kind of ministry, he says, we were under great pressure, under a lot of weight. It was far beyond my ability to endure. It was more than we could handle. It was more than we could deal with. It was more than we could cope with. Then he goes on in verse 9, he says, depending on what your translation is, as it turned out, this vulnerable place, it was the best thing that could have happened. Do you know why it was the best thing that could have happened? Because instead of trusting in our own strength, which is what we have a tendency to do, right? It's kind of our default approach. It's where we go. If we have something going on, we go back to the default approach. We trust in ourselves. Instead of trusting in our own strength or wits to get out of it, instead of doing that, we have to be forced to trust in God fully. Not a bad idea, since he's the God who raises the dead. And so you may find yourself in a place where the bar is just too heavy, where the weight's just a little bit too much, where the pressure is too intense, where the struggle is just a little too overwhelming, and you can't do it. And suddenly, your default approach of trusting in yourself, suddenly that becomes your norm. You say, I got this. It's going to work. People, I can tell you from personal experience, I did it my way for a very long time, and it never worked. It wasn't until I trusted God fully that I started to get it. Now, do I still have struggles? Yes, I do. And so will you. But thank God we do, because in those weaknesses, he becomes strong. And so, as we think through this idea of grace being sufficient and being all we need, and as our praise team comes forward, I want to close and try to help you capture this a little bit. So I'm going to ask you to do something. I know it's a little weird, but it won't hurt. I want you to close your eyes, and I'm going to read you something. This won't be too long. But close your eyes. I just want to kind of picture, if you will, this metaphor that I'm going to describe. So I want you, with your eyes closed here, to picture that you have a cup in your hand. Maybe it's a glass, a mug, but it's a cup. You look down and it's empty. And I want that empty cup then to represent kind of your point of vulnerability, to represent the weakness in your life. Now picture yourself walking over to a hose that's coming out of a huge wall. Now picture yourself walking over there, and you turn on the hose and the water starts coming out. The water represents God's grace. And it comes out of the hose and it starts to fill your cup. Not very fast, but there's a steady stream. You're not even sure it's going to fill it to the top, but it does. And just as it makes it to the top, the water turns off. Now picture yourself a little later coming back. This time, you're carrying an empty bucket. Maybe you've had a little bit of a health scare, or maybe you're struggling to make the grades. Maybe you can barely cover the bills. You just need some grace. but your bucket is a little bigger than your cup. It's a pretty big bucket, actually. And you turn on the hose that's coming out of the wall, and you're not sure if there'll be enough to fill your bucket, but you turn it on anyway. And slowly, the water fills up the bucket. And sure enough, right as it gets to the top, the water stops. Picture yourself a little sometime later. You come back with your wheelbarrow. You need a lot of grace this time because you've lost your job, and with it, your confidence. Your marriage is in pretty rough shape and you feel overwhelmed. Your child with special needs has left you exhausted and you need some grace. And so you grab the hose that's coming out of this huge wall, and sure enough, a stream of water slowly starts to fill the wheelbarrow. But you're pretty sure there won't be enough this time. I mean, it's a big wheelbarrow, but there it is. There's just enough. And as it reaches the top of the water turns off again. Now, one more time, you come back again. This time, you're driving a semi-truck, and it is connected to a massive trailer-sized water tank, and it is completely empty. And you know there won't be enough water to fill this tank. You know that, but you'll take what you can get. You found out that the cancer is terminal. You found out that the company you sacrificed everything for isn't going to make it. You found out about the abuse, or you found out about the affair, and you know there's not going to be enough water. There just can't be, but you're going to take whatever you can. And so you turn that hose on, and the water starts to slowly come out. And it takes a while. It takes quite a while. But eventually, you're amazed as it fills the entire water tank. And at this point, your curiosity gets the best of you. And you look to either side of the wall, and you're wondering, what is that hose connected to? And you realize you can't walk around that wall. And yes, by the way, the wall is a metaphor as well. And so it has to be torn down. You have to tear down the wall, but tearing down walls is hard work, and it can be painful. Oftentimes, they are built up over many years, but you do. You tear it down, and when you tear it down, you follow the hose to its source, and there it is. Miles and miles and miles, as far as you can see, is the ocean. And whatever size of container you come to God with, you can open your eyes now. Whatever size container you come to God with, that's what he feels. So my encouragement to you is to back your truck up, to identify and understand and delight in your weakness. Because when you're weak, he is strong. And as much space as you can identify as weakness, that's when he's going to fill it with his grace. Today, if that's you, if you just need somebody just to pray with, to talk to, we're here. Lakeshore is a great place for that. A great place of prayer, encouragement. But also, there's probably some of you out there that have never received God's grace in the first place. You've never said, I've never accepted Christ as my Savior. This is your opportunity as well to receive that free gift called grace. Grace is greater than our weakness. And if you'll just let him fill that space, you can identify the full potential of God's power in your life. Will you join with me as we stand and as we sing our closing song?